It's been 6 years of podcasting, and without our sponsors, we wouldn't be able to bring these podcasts to you. So I want to thank today's sponsors. And first off, we have the Pretentious Pickle Company of 190 Water Street in Plymouth. If you haven't had a chance to get down there, go down and check out what they make. They have everything pickled you can imagine, from pickled beets to carrots to mushrooms to onions to Brussels sprouts and cauliflower. They even have pickled or pickled flavor cotton candy, I should say. They make it fresh there every day, and you can go in there and check out what they have to offer. And if you're not in the Plymouth area, you can go to pretentiouspickle.com and check out what they have to offer there as well, and they will ship it out to you. Their stuff is delicious. You should check it out, and they are big fans of ours, and we are big fans of theirs. So thank you to the Pretentious Pickle Company for sponsoring today's episode. And our second sponsor today is Moonrise Cinemas. Moonrise Cinemas is a new drive-in in Plymouth, right on the Plymouth-Kingston line. They are located at 428 Court Street in Plymouth, Mass. And they offer a great selection of movies. You can go. It's very family-friendly. I went and checked out the Goonies there. They've had Marvel movies, a wide variety of stuff. And they're really starting to expand. They have had the Rocky Horror Picture Show this coming year. They're doing music on Thursday nights. On Wednesdays are going to be 420 friendly events. So make sure you check out what they have to offer. MoonriseCinemas.com. It's a great venue. They have a beer garden. They have their own food. Their food's phenomenal. And they're bringing back their French toast, which I'm very excited about. So make sure you check out what they have to offer, MoonriseCinemas.com. And if you use code Inebri-art when purchasing tickets, you'll get 10% off. So make sure you go to MoonriseCinemas.com to get your tickets for movies, concerts, and more. And use code Inebri-art for 10% off on your purchase. And now let's jump right into the podcast. Welcome back, Inebri-ites. This is your host, Andy, and today we are joined by an author. It's been a while since we've had an author on, I think. David Allen Schlaefer. Did I get that right?
You got it right.
Oh, sweet.
Sounds good.
I got it right because you compared it to a beer, and so automatically I was able to get that. So David is the author of the Far Northern Land Saga, which is, I believe it's a trilogy, correct? Or a planned trilogy?
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
So just give us the basic rundown. Like what's the book about? Like what can we expect? And the basic starter stuff.
Absolutely. So the Far Northern Land Saga is a fantasy series, a fantasy trilogy that is set in the world of Finnish myth. Okay. And what I mean by that is, I think most fans, if you're a fantasy fan and you like fantasy literature, whether it's all of the great classic literature like The Lord of the Rings and A Wizard of Earthsea and these type of things, or a lot more contemporary fantasy, we're all familiar with Norse mythology. There's so much out there right now. We all know who Loki is, who Thor is, who Odin is. You've got, the movies that have come out. There's probably, who knows, maybe like 100, relatively well-known fantasy books or series of different types that are kind of set in that world with Germanic and Norse myth. But what most people don't know is that the Finns in Finland have their own mythological and folkloric system. Finnish is in a completely separate language group than Indo-European languages. It's not a Germanic language. It's not a Slavic language. The Finns actually came from the Central Asian steppes probably and migrated into what is Finland. And they kept the oral tradition with them of all of this very incredible and really like nature-oriented beliefs about animistic beliefs about, spirits and totem animals and things their magic system that they believed in, which was based upon singing and chanting. They kept all that with them when they moved into Finland, and over the course of, say, 1,000 years, they transmitted all of that down, basically in songs and like oral poetry. It was never written down until the 19th century. And when it was finally put together, it's called the Kalevala. And this is the great Finnish national epic. It played a really big role in the formation of Finnish identity and the, the creation of an independent Finland. It was part of Russia and the Russian Empire at that time. And so my story and my fantasy trilogy is based in that world. It's the world of the Kalevala. It is the world of Finnish myths and folklore. Many of the characters that I use are the great heroes from this incredible, saga and cycle of stories, etc. Of course, many are my own creations. And I use that world. It's kind of Iron Age Finland, let's say, 800, 900 AD or so. You can think of like a very early medieval kind of period or a very early Viking period. That's where the Kalevala kind of came out of and was passed down from. And that's more or less the time setting of the world that I created. And I wanted to do that because I had an opportunity to live in Finland for a very long time, almost 5 years, as a diplomat, as a foreign service officer. And I had been interested in Finnish language and in Finnish folklore for a really long time. I really delved into it while I was there. I'd written stuff in other genres, but I wanted to do this and to put this series together because I wanted to introduce, really, to an English-speaking audience this amazing world, right? This amazing body of literature. It's so cool. It was so perfect for a fantasy story, for a fantasy series. But outside of Finland itself, so few people know about it. So that was my motivation, and that's kind of a little bit about the world that I worked in and that I created, and that you'll see throughout this entire three-book series. It's the second one that just came out a couple of weeks ago. It's The Heir of Lemminkainen, and Lemminkainen is one of the traditional folkloric characters from Finnish myth. The first book is called The Mark of the Bear Clan. That's probably a little bit easier to remember. Or to Google, and the last one hopefully will be out this fall. So over the course of about 1 year, we decided to go ahead and release the whole series.
Nice. It's funny as you're talking about that. I was thinking how, like, as far as an American audience, we're familiar with the Roman gods and, like you said, the Norse gods, and there's kind of Odin and Zeus, there's a lot of parallels. Are there kind of analogs in your stories that are kind of like an Odin type character, or are they completely different? Because the way you're describing it almost made it sound more like a Native American religious kind of like, one with the nature kind of thing.
Yeah, that's really perceptive because I think it's a little bit of both. It's really perceptive that you made the Native American connection because I think there is something to that. Finland was a lot more sparsely populated than the other parts of Scandinavia. It's really not officially a part of Scandinavia, but colloquially, we all think of it as the same thing.
Yeah.
And people lived in, much more basic structures in tribes and in smaller clans and smaller villages. And absolutely, shamans were very, very important in Finnish societies and in their tribes, all the way up until, the Christianization period, which was very late in Finland. Finland was probably just about the last area in what we consider Europe today, where the population converted to Christianity. And even as late as like the 16th and 17th century, you still had individuals that were, practicing shamans in effect that would be living in these communities. And there is a really big part of that that's really analogous, I think, to, what we know from Native American tribal structures and that history in the United States. Very much based in a certain kind of sympathetic magic, so to speak, and very much based upon someone like a shaman, a magic user that would use his or her power for healing, for, ensuring fertility among people or among crops.
Hmm.
Or among the herds, let's say, that they were following. They were also a nomadic people. And so you had the dynamic, just like the Lapps today, right? The Sami people still herd and follow, the reindeer on their trails.
Yeah.
The early did that, and they moved around. Even when they practiced agriculture, they did slash and burn agriculture. So they would, cut down the trees, you burn, a bunch of birch in a field. You
Yeah.
can use that for maybe only 1 or 2 years before it has no more value for actually growing rye or whatever it is you're growing, and you move on. And I think that that's something also very similar to the Native American tribes, or to many of the Native American tribes, much more of that itinerant and migratory kind of lifestyle. So there's elements of both,
Yeah.
They're definitely very different. There are some analogs. The big Finnish cultural hero is Vainamoinen. Very well known in Finland. This is the Gandalf, let's say, kind of figure
Okay.
of Finnish. He's a shaman. He is a wizard. He was present in the creation of the world and was one of the first, figures or beings to be created. And he plays some kind of a role, big or little, in just about all of the poems that were collected from all of these different songs. And there are some Odin type elements there,
Hmm.
that probably bled in over the years and over the centuries, as the Finns had closer and closer contact, with their neighbors. So there's some of that too, but it's really unique. It's certainly not just a Finnish version or Finnish replication of
Yeah.
all of the Germanic stuff. It's very unique, and it's much more grounded, as you mentioned, in the natural world, I think, and in speaking to people that were living in very small groups, in very, very harsh elements,
Hmm.
with tremendous challenges just to try to survive. There's a lot of wisdom and a lot of proverbs, and I tried to draw upon that and really scatter that throughout my work as well. So it's pretty cool stuff. And again, some of it has been used in some other series, the names or the characters, but I wasn't able to find, any series as I started looking and exploring this a decade ago,
Yeah.
that had been written in English that was just absolutely fully set in this world. I thought that was pretty exciting. And again, I hope that it would introduce, for fantasy fans, it would be an introduction to Finland, to this folklore. And if they like it, that they would go further and maybe read a little bit of the Kalevala, or, dig in and find out some other information about this really cool folkloric system that just not too many people know about.
Yeah. It's amazing how many like folklore stories are kind of like under everyone's nose that we know the the ones that have been made into Disney movies and stuff like that.
Right, right.
But one of our other shows, we just recapped local folklore and cryptids, and so each host picked, went online and kind of researched one, and there was one I had never heard of, and like I've lived in the South Shore area my entire life, and it was about kind of like the discovery of Martha's Vineyard, and it was this giant that lived amongst the Native Americans, and it was just like, I feel like how do you live your whole life here and not even know that is a
How did
thing?
you miss it? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. That's funny.
Now, I feel like here in the U.S. there's a big kind of push for the Native Americans to kind of like reclaim their heritage and make sure that the languages aren't lost. Is there that kind of thing amongst the Finns where this is kind of a bygone religion and belief system? Are they trying to like document it better and make sure it doesn't fade away?
Yeah, I think to some extent, I think you can say that it plays a living role, let's put it that way, in the day-to-day life of every Finn.
Hmm.
So it is much more present in Finland Then, we talked a little bit about the Norse or the Germanic myths. That's kind of like history and folkloric background, I think. If
Hmm.
you're living in Sweden or Norway or Germany, there'll be some company names and, there'll be some books and things like that out there, but it's not really a present part of your life. And I think it is for most Finns. The Kalevala and that sense of identity, again, it really gave them a sense of identity as a people, as a distinct nation, not just a country, but as a nation, and then after that, a nation state. And so in that sense, it is very much alive. There are some people, it's a very smaller number that take that one step further, and maybe they are involved in like neo-pagan, religion that
Right.
draws back upon that time period. Certainly, there are people that do that. I don't think it's that widespread, but you could be the most, button-down Nokia executive, walking down the street in Helsinki or something like that, and you are still going to, daily, weekly, or whatever, at some point, kind of draw with you or carry with you that sense of identity that is so interwoven with these stories and with this folklore. So I think it is unique in that sense. There's not that many places in the Western world, probably,
Hmm.
where for the majority of people, something like that is still informing their lives, and they think about it consciously. It's
Yeah.
not just unconscious, it's like a very conscious thing that is there throughout Finnish society, even to this day. And I think that's really helped them survive. It's a small country, right? It's only
Right.
5 million people. So not a lot of people, they survived Soviet invasion, during the Second World War,
Hmm.
suffered tremendously, but were able to retain their independence and did not get reincorporated, like the Baltic countries did
Yep.
in the Soviet Union. I think that sense of identity that is so connected with all of this folklore and all of this mythology has played a real part and a significant part in allowing Finns, Finland, whatever, to survive and to still be here in the 21st century, and not just to be, a group that ethnographers read about and study about today, like the Livonians or some of these other groups that are very obscure and that lived in this Nordic Baltic area, but with their languages kind of, passed away as they were assimilated into other groups and passed from the scene. And somehow the Finns are still there, and it's a cool thing. It's a really great country.
I was actually lucky enough to go to Finland for I think I was only there for
Oh,
like 2 days. It was gorgeous.
right.
Absolutely on my list of places to go back. That was a cruise. We went around the Baltics and hit a bunch
Okay,
of different
yeah.
places.
So much fun.
Um,
That's great. That's
oh, it's
great.
gorgeous. Um, but you were talking about kind of the assimilation process, and the Christian church is known very much for its assimilation, where we kind of go to these different countries and tribes and people, whatever, and incorporate Christmas trees. Yeah, we got Christmas trees kind of thing. Is there
Right.
like Finnish traditions or Finnish stories that people would recognize that's been kind of rehashed into something else that you know?
Um, kind of. I don't know if it's necessarily related to religion. Although, real quickly, as an aside, I'll mention that over time, Christianity was incorporated into the Kalevala, and
Oh,
it's kind
really?
of interesting. It was.
Yeah.
So, especially in some of the last stories and some of the last tales, okay, in the Kalevala itself, there's this melding and this merging where there will be in the same story one element that is absolutely a paganistic,
Hmm.
type of element, and in the very next paragraph, a reference, to the Christ child being born or something, kind of at the end of all this epic, and this ushers in, the new age, and Wainamoinen gets into his boat and sails away, and that's kind of how the epic ends. And that was grafted on,
Hmm.
over the years to all of these stories, so that, in a lot of ways, just as we celebrate Christmas at a certain time or
Yeah.
Easter at a certain time, because, even back during the Roman age, the church authorities and then the imperial authorities were trying to meld existing, non-Christian festivals, etc., with the emerging religion. Exact same thing happens, in
Yeah.
Finland with all of these tales. So that's kind of cool and it's kind of interesting. And that went on for a long time. But as far as influence and everything, maybe not the Kalevala affecting a religious dynamic, but it has had a really big effect upon literature. And we're talking about fantasy. And the biggest work that it had an effect upon is J.R. Tolkien and Middle Earth and the Lord of the Rings.
Well, as soon as you said, I'm sorry, I'm gonna
Yeah, not at all.
the main character,
Vainamoinen.
Vainamoinen, got
Right.
into a ship and sailed away. I immediately jumped to Gandalf and
Yeah.
Frodo going to the Undying Lands. That was the immediate.
There's a lot of that, yeah. So, of course, Tolkien was a philologist, and he studied language. He created, as we know, all of the languages in the Lord of the Rings, the two main Elven languages, Quenya and Sindarin, and everything else. And that really was almost kind of the spark for beginning to write the stories that he wrote.
Yeah.
Hobby, even when he was a kid, was developing these languages and then coming up with kind of the story around what the language was about. But when he was a student, he found, I guess, he usually described as a primer, kind of a dictionary, I guess, with an explanation of the Finnish language. And again, this is this very unique language, Finno-Ugric language group. Only a handful of contemporary languages in that group, really Finnish and Estonian being the only two. And he was blown away by this. He thought that it was amazing. He thought that it was a beautiful language, completely different in tone and in phonology, I believe the right word would be, than anything else that he was aware of. And then from that, he read these stories in the Kalevala. And that was a tremendous inspiration to him. So both characters in The Hobbit and in The Lord of the Rings, a Vainamoinen, and without going into too much detail, some others heavily influenced characters in The Lord of the Rings. You remember Tom Bombadil, the character in the Lord of the Rings? He didn't make it into the movies.
Into the movies, right?
Peter Jackson cut him out, but you may recall that he is depicted like as the master of song, right? He's always singing, and basically the magic that he uses, so to speak, he uses it in the form of songs. Remember, he teaches the hobbits that song to sing when the Barrow Wight has captured them. Frodo begins singing that song, and lo and behold, he appears. All of that is taken right out of the Kalevala, so to speak. That was the influence of what Tolkien read that he wove into that character. And in the Silmarillion and the stories of the First Age, I guess we're not going to get that in the Amazon series. That's the Second Age of Middle Earth, but there'll be a little bit of that and some echoes in there. Some of that is largely influenced by the Kalevala. So if any of your fans have ever read the Silmarillion, anyone watching, I don't know if you have or not, I'm a huge Tolkien fan, so I've read everything. Maybe the biggest hero in that book is a character called Turin Turambar, right? The Master of Doom by Doom Mastered. And that character is 100% based upon a character in the Kalevala called Kullervo. He is a serf. He is, oppressed by the people who have come into his father's lands and taken them over. And, he's basically an oppressed slave. He's put through a series of tasks, etc. He rebels. He rises up, kills his tormentors. Through this roundabout way, he winds up meeting his sister, with whom he's been separated, doesn't know who she is. They get married. She has a child. They discover what is going on. She throws herself, into a river in despair when she realizes what has happened. He takes a sword and falls upon it and kills himself. The whole thing, every single element, Tolkien was inspired by that. And the tale of Turin in the Silmarillion, and he was very open about it. It's like, I'm
Yeah.
not plagiarizing this. This is my version of this amazing Finnish story. That was his version of this chapter, 5 chapters actually, that go through the tale of Kalervo in the Kalevala. So I mentioned that a little bit long-winded, but to give your audience a really good example of the influence that this had, on this, classic work
Right.
by Tolkien, which is the genesis of modern fantasy, right? We wouldn't
Yeah.
have this whole genre if it wasn't for Tolkien and for C.S. Lewis, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And so that influence of the Kalevala, then, no one knows it, but it is there everywhere. The orcs that are
Yep.
goblins in The Hobbit, absolutely taken from the same magical race that is in the Kalevala. The Finnish word is hisia, but that was the Tolkien conceptualization of what goblins were. That then became orcs, which are ubiquitous in every game, or
Oh yeah.
every story that you see. So it is cool. There are connections and things like that that nobody is aware of, really, that through Tolkien, came out of all of this Finnish folklore and myth, and now is spread out, in our contemporary culture, just all over the place. And, as I was growing up and I was reading and studying some of this and getting more into it, and, I would start to make that realization,
Mm-hmm.
like, oh my God, look at this. Oh my God, look at that. And make those connections. And I can remember doing that. And it was a really amazing thing, kind of a cathartic process for me
Yep.
to realize just how much this relatively obscure to English speakers, body of historical poetry or whatever, was such a real presence, but just an unconscious, presence in the UK and the US and Australia, and other places too.
Now, when you're writing, I was kind of in my head thinking about the Marvel movies, and when you start off, there's Iron Man and Captain America, and any slight variation, the fans would get all in a tizzy, being like, whatever silly little um slight variation. And then as you get into kind of the later stuff like Guardians of the Galaxy and Eternals, they're a lot more forgiving because there's fewer fans and they know less about them. Did you feel like a real need where you're writing in this world that isn't of your own, and there's already literature and basis for it, to really stick to it? Did you take some liberties with it? Like, how much restraint did you have, like, as you're writing the story?
That is another great question, because it's something I really put a lot of thought into it, and I really, struggled with it. And, I was writing this again for English speakers, right? I did live
Right.
in Finland quite a long time, almost 5 years, and I studied Finnish for an entire year before I went to Helsinki. I wasn't coming into it, so to speak, completely in left field. But I was also very aware I'm an American doing this, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not Finnish, and there is something kind of audacious, I think, about attempting that and trying to pull it off.
Yeah.
So I was really concerned about that, and I was concerned about what Finns would think of that. Obviously, I've got a ton of Finnish friends because I lived there for so long, and I joined the Kalevala Society, and I did all this kind of stuff while I was there. And I certainly didn't want to do anything that was basically just going to piss off any Finn
Right.
that
Yeah.
read it and make them really angry, and think that it was something that was disrespectful, to them or to their culture. And that's kind of how I approached it. And I certainly had a lot of conversations with my language teachers in particular,
Mm-hmm.
who were really big mentors to me, just to friends, to some people that were in Finland who deal with this in a professional way. They were all very encouraging, and I think they all understood what I wanted to do and what I was trying to do in terms of popularizing, let's say, all of this to audiences that were unaware of it. So they all thought that it was a pretty cool thing. And that balance that I struck, that you're asking about is, while the world and some of the motifs, let's say,
Hmm.
and certainly the description of the physical world, the agriculture, what the villages would have been like, what the climate would have been like, and the challenges that the characters face just as a result of that. Well, all of that is absolutely true to life, and also taken, let's say, directly in some way from what is described in the Kalevala. I did not use any of the stories in the Kalevala at all.
Okay.
So I use characters. I use the magical system, which is based upon songs, enchanted incantations. I use the general clash of the Kalevala, which is the clash between the antagonist. Her name is Lohi. She's the Witch of the North. This is the personification of winter,
Okay.
to the fans. That is the role basically that she plays. That is how historically this character, came into being in all of these songs. She is the antagonist, and that conflict between winter trying to take over, right? Trying
Hmm.
to destroy, trying to return this land to this pristine type of state. While I took all that, I absolutely stayed away from any of the storylines that are in the Kalevala. And that is kind of the balance that I struck. There's one very important magical object in the Kalevala. It's called a Sampo, Sampo. And sometimes you'll see references to it in other fantasy works and stuff.
Hmm.
It's kind of cool because no one knows what it is. It's not really described in the Kalevala. It's
Okay.
been interpreted in different ways, and usually it's interpreted as a mill, like a hand mill, a
Hmm.
magic mill that would make gold or some other kind of really valuable thing. I wanted the Sampo in there, but I took a completely different interpretation of it, right? I
Yeah.
made it into something very, very different. I did not make it the Sampo of the Kalevala itself. I thought it was really important to do that, both so that I wasn't trying to present my story, when I was kind of plagiarizing, let's say,
Yeah.
from this, tremendous folkloric tradition, but just being inspired by it rather, and drawing on it. That was a balance that I tried to strike. I hope that I did a good job. I think as a writer, doubtless, no matter what you're trying to do, you're going to fail in many
Hmm.
ways. But I do hope that the sincerity of the attempt is recognized, and that I succeeded more times than I failed. And I think most of the feedback that I've gotten from all of my Finnish friends and some fans who have left comments on my website and stuff like that has been positive. And the main characters of the story of my saga, they are my characters.
Yeah.
There's really two protagonists. They're children in the first book. There's about 7 or 8 years between each book, so that makes it a true trilogy.
Yeah.
We think of the Lord of the Rings, for example, as a trilogy, but it's really not. Tolkien was always quick to say it's just one continuous story, right?
Right. Right.
And definition of a trilogy is like separate, distinct, books, typically with some time, in between them. So they grow and they
Hmm.
mature, and they are, young man and a young woman by the time that the story ends. The first protagonist, just a little girl in the first book, she survived something that was actually all too common at that time, which is being attacked by a bear, by a mother bear, after stumbling upon the bear and her cub. She's almost killed. She is saved by Wainamoinen, this culture hero that we've been talking about. Um, and the attack leaves her with something on her back, and she's mutilated to some extent, by this attack. This scar upon her back and shoulder that looks incredibly and improbably like a bear claw, which is the totem for her clan
Hmm.
and for her people. Um, this doesn't happen by accident, right?
Yeah.
We know that from folklore and lots of fantasy books and everything. And without going into too much detail, that is what launches her down this path that the Finns called the Trail for Singers. And that was the life path for a shaman or for a wizard. And I love that translation. That is, the actual historical phrase, the trail for singers, like an animal trail or a
Right.
reindeer trail. I think it's a reindeer trail probably that
Hmm.
they were getting at. And that launches her down this path with Wainamoinen as her mentor, second protagonist, her opposite in every way. It's a young man. It's not a little girl. It's not a young
Hmm.
woman. Well, she comes from this, I think I describe it in the copy for the book, this hard scrabble village that most Finns would have lived in. He comes from a place of privilege. He comes from a noble family on the coast. He is thrust into a position of power unexpectedly when he is still very young. He does not have the gift of song. He does not have the gift of singing, the gift of magic. That is not his role or destiny or purpose, if
Yep.
such things exist, which is kind of one of the themes that I try to explore. Does destiny exist? How does free will operate in these type of contexts, in these kind of stories? And so it's a double drama with those two characters as the main characters, and then the traditional characters, Vainamoinen, Lemminkainen, a female character, Mielikki, who is the lady of the forest, let's say. Those are the supporting characters. And that is kind of the backdrop of the world that our main characters find themselves in as they slowly become engaged in this titanic clash that is physical but also spiritual with Loki, with the antagonist that we mentioned, with this ethereal personification of winter, let's say,
Yeah.
who can take different aspects and who is attacking the Finnish people at that time in the story. So that's how I tried to navigate that, and I hope I did a good job. I certainly really thought about it and tried very, very hard to get that right, so that what I was doing would be a contribution and a positive amplification of Finnish stuff and Finnish folklore, but nothing that would come across as arrogant. This arrogant
Right.
American who thinks that he can actually weave these stories about our literature and about our culture. Certainly, I wanted to avoid that.
So I've been a lifelong fantasy fan. Not a big reader, a little dyslexic, so reading's a little tough for me. But movies and cartoons. I mean, I discovered Tolkien from the Rankin Bass cartoons.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, but
still
oh, so good and bad at the same time. Um,
best.
but like in a big D&D nerd, there's nothing better than the Balrog or um uh oh my god, why am I blanking on the I'm blanking on like the big D&D monster that I can't think of, big eye and eye stalks. I can't think of his
The beholder, the
yes, thank
beholder.
you, thank you so much. Is there a monster in the book? Are there monsters in the Finnish legend?
Yeah, there are absolutely, and that is one of the really neat things about the stories. So just like Germanic folklore, let's say, and Norse folklore was populated with elves and dwarves and other creatures like that. There were analogs in Finnish myth, probably even more
Yeah.
than in the Germanic stories. And so, yes, there are these magical races. I use both the Finnish names for
Mhm.
them and the anglicized names that have come to be associated with them. So there is an elvish race. There is a dwarvish race. There is a race of gnomes. There are people who you would identify as a sylph. You think about you talking about D&D. Remember the women or the ladies that would basically like live in trees or live in the forests.
Yeah, yeah,
The
yep.
sylphs, and quite a few others. They are more morally ambiguous, maybe
Yeah.
than in some other stories. So they're not all good. They're not all bad. Most of them in the Finnish context simply have their own existence and, their own hopes, desires, whatever, and aren't really necessarily that concerned with the world of humans and mortal men and women, as it were. They play very prominent roles in my stories. There are monstrous type of creatures, less wholesome creatures. There's almost a race, and they don't come into play until the last book. But they're almost like the Morlocks, if you think about the Time Machine.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And you had that subterranean, race that had, kind of deformed itself. They were humans, right? That was the whole conceit of you had the Eloi, the beautiful, people on top, and they were the unwitting, food basically for the subterranean dwellers. There's a race very, very similar to that in different ways that winds up coming in. There are a couple of dragons, and the Finns had their own version of dragons, a little bit different in their ability and a little bit different in their appearance, but still that it seems almost universal, right? I mean, Chinese had it, Japanese had it, that concept of a giant snake or a giant worm, maybe winged, maybe not winged, but that was a monstrous creature, and that is a part of the world as well. So it's one of the really neat things about the folklore. And I certainly populated the world then that I created and that I built with all of those races and all of those creatures in it. And much of the first book in particular is Ulla's journey with Wainamoinen, and they're kind of traveling all throughout the far northern land. I never used the word Finland in the entire series until the last page, actually. The far northern land is, in effect, this area. And journeying from land to land, from kingdom to kingdom, let's say, they're not really kingdoms, but area to area, and encountering these different creatures and places and races that populate Finnish folklore. And I actually was inspired by that, by Earthsea. So if you remember Ursula K. Le Guin, Wizard of Earthsea, Tombs of Atuan, Farthest Shore, the first three books of the Earthsea series, sometimes called the Earthsea trilogy, that was kind of the strategy that she used. Her main character, Sparrowhawk or Ged, is just in his boat, and he's traveling, right? And he's going from island to island and from land to land. I really liked that. And I thought that was a really cool way that she developed her world, starting off small, but then slowly and gradually expanding it through his travels. And so I tried to incorporate the same thing, so that my main character, Ulla, she does the same thing. She's in that little village and has had a very small life at the beginning, but slowly through the course of traveling, that world begins to grow and her horizons expand, and it allows the reader then to get a glimpse of all of these cool and amazing and unusual things.
Yeah, that's very cool. It sounds like an amazing series. I didn't, going into this interview, I had no idea it was about Finland. So now I'm really intrigued because I do love history and folklore, and I know nothing about Finnish folklore other than what I've learned today. So it sounds like something really, really cool to check out. Can you tell our listeners where they can go to get the books, find out more, or follow you on all the socials, yada, yada, yada?
Absolutely. That sounds good. So a couple different places. You can go to my website. So that's www.davidschlaefer, just my name.com. And there'll be, links to where you can buy the book. There are some short passages. The maps for the book are also on the website, and I'll mention that just really quickly because I did have some beautiful maps that were drawn by a very well-known fantasy cartographer. She goes by the pen name, I guess, if that's correct, of Misty B. And absolutely beautiful maps that she used. I think, like a lot of fantasy fans, one of the the first thing I want to do when I open up the book is let's
check out the map. Yeah.
She did an amazing job, really beautiful, and those are on the website. And you can also get in touch with me and leave messages or questions if you'd like. I have a Facebook author page that is the Far Northern Land, so the name of the saga. You can go to the Facebook page as well, and you can also find my social media on Twitter and on Instagram. So you can go to any of those places, and it will direct you both to where you can check out the books and also to the website, where you can check out some of the other cool stuff I mentioned.
Outstanding. Let's have you back in the fall when your next book comes out, because I would love to hear more. I feel like we just scratched the surface here.
Sounds cool.
Cool. This was a lot of fun. I want to say thank you for taking the time to talk to us. And to our listeners, thank you for listening, and we'll catch you guys again next week.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
And thanks for checking out the show today, listeners. If you enjoyed the content today, you can go over to patreon.com/Inebri-art to support the show. You can join over there for just a few dollars a month and help us provide this fun content that you just checked out. You can also email us at Inebri-art.com with your questions, complaints, and concerns, or you can find us on all social medias at Inebri-art or at Inebri-art6 on Instagram. And also don't forget to check out our other shows, Bar Talk Podcast, Old Colony Cast, Inebri-art, and all the other shows on the Inebri-art Network, which you can find at Inebri-art.com. Thanks again for listening.